hear you very well.
Great. Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizer, COAR, IFLA, and FAO for arranging this webinar on a very important and timely topic about the Sustainable Development Goals. Um, and as we well know, within a couple of weeks, these many 17 goals and targets will be finalized. And I'm sure not all of us are happy with all the goals and all the targets and so forth, but this is why I kind of named the title both challenges and opportunities. There are, in fact, many gaps in these goals and the way they were arrived at, but then also because they are so broad in many cases, we can see ourselves embedding important initiatives and ideas into these goals. So I think it's incumbent on us to help improve these goals and targets and play a part in it. So I'm glad Warren Ifla.
Leslie,
Yeah.
your volume is very low. Could you, I don't know if you can get closer to the microphone?
Okay. Is this a little bit better?
This is better, yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, that was a quick preamble, and this is what I plan to do this morning. And I'd like to start off with some uh, explaining to you some of my own approaches to um, talking about open access and open science. Um, and then because I think some of my perspective may be different from some of the others, and I think it's important that I guess make clear my own biases and preferences so that my interpretation and what I would recommend would make more sense in that context. And then I will point to specific aspects of the SDGs where I think open access and open science could play a particular role. And I will be emphasizing particularly the importance of building knowledge infrastructures as a way for strengthening capacity, research capacity development in developing countries as a key policy considerations. And again, I will detail the rationale. First of all, want to, as I said, I want to just give you, by way of background, my own understanding of open access. So this BioLine International Initiative were started by colleagues of mine based in Brazil and the UK over 20 some odd years ago in the early days of the internet. And their idea that back then was to make available journals, peer-reviewed journals from the developing countries on the internet so that anyone can read, download, and reuse the research that are coming from the developing world, which at the time, over 20 years ago, were not available outside on their own region. So this was a project that was born well before the term open access was actually coined, but we've been in operation since. And we have worked with many colleagues from different parts of the world, and I just highlight some of the crop science related journals because of FAO's hosting this webinar today. So I just want to emphasize that we've been working with different scientific organizations focusing on crop science research and food security issues. So uh, from from a long time, for a long time now, we've understand that people have been downloading articles on my website on a consistent basis. In the past year, there were over 4 million downloads from the site, and it's really quite showing that a lot of people from around the world are using these research, and there's a very big demand for research from the developing regions, particularly in these areas of health and food security. So one of the questions that I've been interested in for a long time is, well, is what can open access? As I was saying, so one of the questions I've been very interested in is whether open access could in fact challenge the existing power dynamics of the global scientific publishing enterprise. which, as many of you know, is still dominated by a small handful of powerful multinational publishers. And on top of that, as Jean-Claude Guidon has eloquently illustrated in his webinar a week ago, that these power structures not only control the content, but also the means of accreditations. And through the journal impact factor, for example, of sanctioning basically what constitute legitimate science or world science, as Jean-Claude put it, and peripheral knowledge. And through those kind of gatekeeping function, essentially the world knowledge been divided into those that are uh, uh, legitimate or included in the indexing services and those that are excluded and left out in the margin. And that includes much of the research from the developing world and non-English speaking literature. So the question is, can open access alter that dynamic and create a world where it is much more equitable in terms of knowledge flow and knowledge sharing instead of the one-way flow that you see here with the global north dominating both the structure and the agenda of what constitutes legitimate research. And also, we were interested in knowing whether open access in fact create new spaces for collaboration and spaces for co-creation of knowledge. So openness to us means a lot more than simply gaining access to research publication. It is really more about understanding how we can enable a different view of looking at knowledge as a whole, as a form of public goods. And as such, how can we think about enabling policies that could enable this kind of thinking to be carried out? Um, Most of us, when we talk about open access, we tend to think about free of cost barriers and the free of copyright barriers and the ability to reuse and share. But increasingly, our understanding of openness has to include the right to engage in research. And I think this is a big component of what we think of as open science. And that is the rights of citizens, regardless of their ability to engage in knowledge production so that their views are included in terms of the research agenda and also what is being done about the research output and what kind of impact these output will ultimately have. And so openness has to include participation in an inclusive way, meaning that it's really not just for the expert, but for citizens alike. And that collaboration has to be equitable. And we know that a lot of so-called North-South collaborations are really, again, lopsided, asymmetrical, with Northern research agenda dictating the directions of research, and often researchers from the global south are kind of token part of a team. And this is not what would constitute equitable collaboration. And openness has to include changing that dynamic. And finally, we also think that in order to change that power structure, we need to challenge the current cognitive injustice that is promoted by global science, that is only privileging certain view, certain way of doing science as being the only or the legitimate way of understanding the world. There are many, many ways of knowing, and it is important that we take into consideration the diversity of understanding the world, and that this will ultimately enrich all of us. And so, and I'm happy to see that there are other scholars working in other areas, particularly into the access to knowledge arena, also seeing science in this inclusive way. And here's an example of the right to science as a means to coalesce a world that is often fragmented, as Leah Schaefer called. And so how do we connect uh, ideas, knowledge from around the world in a truly inclusive way? So this is a backdrop to a research network that has started last year, and we're lucky to have funding from the IDRC in Canada and DIFID from the UK to support a network project to investigate to what extent and under what condition these kind of openness actually are being practiced. What makes them possible? What what create barriers for this kind of research practices. And both the IDRC and DFID has been very supportive of this whole notion of open development. The idea, really the propositions or hypothesis that increasingly with ubiquitous network access, we are seeing different kind of models of knowledge productions. And along with that, different kind of licensing and rights regime that would enable greater participation from across the knowledge domain and citizens and scientists to work together to create different kinds of social and economic benefits. And at the same time, if we were to see this vision come true, we need to be able to develop much richer conceptual framework uh, and to conceptualize different way of knowing. And again, as Jean-Claude mentioned in his webinar, I mean, we're still dependent on the journal as the currency of legitimation. And we need to broaden our understanding of now increasingly the need to understand the research life cycle. And as we open up the data arena and open up different ways of knowing, how can we also allow different form of intellectual output or scientific output to be represented and to be also legitimized at the same time? And most importantly, how can we support these kind of activities and endeavor through development of common infrastructures? Again, this is my emphasis. And then, of course, if we were to build these common infrastructures, who would pay for it and how do we maintain it collectively? Now, again, I just don't want to belabor the point too much, but the idea is that we are actually doing research to find out empirically what's being done and what are some of the principles that are emerging from various projects that we are also supporting. At the same time, we want to understand what kind of common tools, standards, and so forth that need to be conceived, created together in order to help us promote this view of inclusive science. Right now, we're supporting a large number of projects with different varieties of practices from around the world. You can always go to our website and look at some of these sub-projects, and they are all investigating openness in slightly different ways. And we hope to, in a couple of years, be able to come to more generalizations about what this openness, whether they in fact challenge the kind of inclusive science that we are hoping to see. And this is a kind of conceptual framework that we're working on at the moment to try to help us understand the relationship between the practices of so-called open science, including open access, open data, and collaborative research, building on the principle of knowledge as a common good and the rights to knowledge as a social justice. If we were to engage in these activities, then how do we need to rethink the funding structure? And most importantly, the incentive structure that will allow researchers and organizations to participate in this and benefit from it at the same time. And these are not easy questions, obviously, and I would look very much forward to some of your feedback. And again, this is a research project, so we engage in as only 1 year into the process. So we hope to be able to share with you more as we develop this project deeper. Now back to the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, so and many of you know there are now up to 17 goals. Now, hopefully there are no more. I don't think there will add any more. But there are still many targets and being developed and indicators within these goals that would then allow us to evaluate whether these goals are achieved or not. Now, there have been, of course, a lot of criticism of the predecessors to the SDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. And some people think that the SDGs are basically more of the same and will commit a lot of the same problem and errors of the MDGs, meaning that a lot of the decision making were top down and not really consultative. But then the SDGs, and many of you have involved in much broader consultative process, was in fact different in terms of how they were arrived at. There were a lot of global consultation, both local, community-based, national-based, been a lot of consultations. But yet there are still a lot of gaps. And one of the gaps is that as you read these goals, you'll notice that they're really directed. Seems like they're a generic statement, not directed at anybody, and it's difficult to know who's supposed to take charge and be responsible for these different goals. So in that sense, that's a bit of a big challenge. But on the other hand, as I said earlier, there's also an opportunity because by having these fairly open statements, organizations such as COAR and IFLA and FAO can assume responsibility among some of these different goals. And this is, in fact, what many organizations are doing, seeing themselves being able to contribute to some of these goals and help define them in more concrete ways. So here, let me just identify some of the goals that I think we can insert ourselves into through open science and open access. In fact, I think we can do that for every single goals, almost most of the targets, but I won't have time to go into every one of them. So I'll just give some examples. The first one about ending poverty in all its forms everywhere, and number 9 about building resilient infrastructures, and number 16 about promoting inclusive and access of justice to all. Uh, for the first goal, obviously, one of the things that we need to address is the problem of knowledge poverty or information poverty, an issue that IFLA have addressed also through the Lyon Declaration. And in terms of infrastructure, one of the things that I would advocate is the building of inclusive knowledge infrastructures that can be used by everybody. And again, the challenge, of course, is how to do that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I mentioned earlier about a rights-based approach to looking at science, and I think number 16 actually would allow us to do that as well, to embed the rights to research and the rights to science as a form of cognitive justice into goal number 16. So these are sort of very broad level highlight about how we can insert some of these into the Millennium Development Goal. I want to quickly shift gear a little bit. Last week in Kenya, there was a launch of this new alliance called the Alliance for Accelerating Excellence in Science in Africa. And this is an interesting initiative where 3 large funding agencies, the DFID in the UK, Wellcome Trust, and Bill and Melinda Foundations, are putting seed money into this alliance, allowing the alliance to then give out funding to scientific research in Africa. That is, instead of having these agencies dictate or tell fund applicants what they should apply for, this alliance will decide on the research agenda and allow researchers in Africa to apply for the funding, which I think is a great initiative with some exceptions. Now, this is an interesting statistic they presented, and that is that even though African constitute 15% of the population of the world, there's only 2% of the world research output. And this is a familiar image that many of you have seen before in other contexts. That is, when you map the world according to these scientific output, and particularly according to Thomson's ISI's citation index, which actually the previous slides also depended upon, you get a very distorted view of the world, which doesn't necessarily represent the knowledge output of these different parts of the world. It's just that the very particular lens on which one sees through knowledge production create this kind of distortion. And as I said earlier, we need to challenge this underlying structure. And in fact, the SDG, one of the weakness of the SDG is that it doesn't fundamentally challenge a lot of the existing power dynamics that is causing a lot of the inequality, both in wealth and in knowledge. And we need to fundamentally challenge that. We can begin by asking how much of the research output from Africa are relevant to the problems faced by Africans. And I would like to call on the Alliance here to really think about the whole dynamics of global versus local. And again, not to buy into the ideology of excellence, which Zhongko have dissected so well. And that is the idea that in order to be excellent, you have to be competitive and you have to be exclusive. Whereas the different way of conceiving knowledge could be one of quality and inclusiveness, that it doesn't have to be about hierarchy. And that is also part of what open science is about. So I would strongly urge the Alliance to think about embedding openness, open science, open access as the core principle, and begin to think about building infrastructures. We tend to think of infrastructures and roads and bridges and TV towers and so forth, but knowledge infrastructures are actually extremely important these day and age. And when so much of the science is done through network. And a lot of these network infrastructures are invisible to us, but they do cost money. They do cost a lot of care, and they do cost long-term maintenance issues. So we need to wrap our head around how to support knowledge infrastructures. And I like this quote from a recent publication by Christine Boltman and her research team on knowledge infrastructure. And that is, the infrastructures are really complex ecology, and they change dynamically depending on both technology, the policies, and the stakeholders. And we are only beginning to understand how these infrastructures work because they are so complex. But we cannot ignore them, and we need to pay a lot of attention in how we can collaboratively come to understanding on how to support and build these infrastructures. And again, organizations like IFLA, FAO, and COAR, and I would mention also IFLA, Electronic Information for Library. These are organizations that have a lot of expertise in this together already, and we could all collectively work together to think about these infrastructural issues. And I put this slides in because I want to remind us, and for example, in Africa, a lot of the research funding that goes into countries are coming from outside of those countries. And the result of that is that a lot of those research monies are about getting research and then shipping them out. It's more of an extractive approach to research. That is, researchers come in, do the work, they take the data, and then publish them elsewhere. And that's the problem when funding are coming from the outside. And this is why national government have to be committed to supporting science and development locally. I mentioned the Accelerating Excellence Alliance earlier, and those are still money coming from external funders. Where are the national governments from Africa in this? And they must step up, they must put in support, they must both financially and through other kinds of resources, and also through development of appropriate policies. And this policy has to be directed at building strong infrastructure locally, because again, they are the foundation of capacity for their own scientists, for the future training of their own future generation. Without the infrastructures, the resources in terms of knowledge will always be extracted and taken out of the continent. I want to end by a cautionary example and what can happen if we don't think enough about infrastructure collectively. And this is also a recent article that was published in PLOS by Dora Caños and her colleagues. And they are from a really dynamic about diversity research center based in Brazil. Now, I'm biased because CREA is also the main organization behind BioLine that I mentioned earlier, and they have been doing really amazing, innovative work on biodiversity database and infrastructures and interoperability standards. But their work has always been funded through different kind of research funding without really having broad-based policy by the government and by other organizations to collectively support the e-infrastructures. One of the very dynamic infrastructures they created is called the species link, and his development has been based on different parts of funding. And when these parts of funding runs out, this very, very important database and tool may become inaccessible. And as a result of it, a huge database with his enormous riches for understanding biodiversity, not only in Brazil but around the world, would be lost. And collectively, we would all be much poorer. And I think it is important that we think not beyond the local, because increasingly infrastructure is scaled to become a global resource. And so being able to think collectively as how openness allow us to create a global commons is something that, again, something that we need to think about collectively. Again, just flash a framework to remind ourselves that there are these are my biases and there are these things that are guiding my own thinking, but they're by no means solid, and they need to be still worked on, fleshed out. And I look forward to your feedback and criticism. Thank you very much.